Can a 37-year-old army captain really save a nation that's been bleeding for decades? When you see Ibrahim Traore's name attached to questions about African democracy, you're probably wondering if this young Burkinabe leader represents hope or just another military strongman who'll make things worse. The answer isn't what you think, and it reveals something disturbing about democracy's future across an entire continent. Ibrahim Traore didn't just seize power in Burkina Faso. He exposed the fundamental failure of democratic institutions across West Africa. While Western media portrays him as another military coup leader, the reality is far more complex and troubling. His rise to power represents the culmination of decades of democratic disappointment, where elected governments repeatedly failed their people while foreign powers maintained their grip on African resources. Traore's story isn't just about one country or one leader. It's about whether democracy as we know it can survive in a continent where it has consistently failed to deliver basic security, economic progress, or genuine sovereignty. What makes his case particularly significant is that he's not alone. Across the Sahel region, military leaders are toppling democratically elected governments to popular acclaim, suggesting that something fundamental has broken in Africa's relationship with democratic governance. Ibrahim Traore's path to power began long before his military coup in September 2022. Born in 1988 in a small village in Burkina Faso, he grew up watching his country hemorrhage under the weight of jihadist violence and political incompetence. Unlike many African military leaders who come from privileged backgrounds, Traore emerged from the ranks of ordinary soldiers who were actually fighting and dying on the front lines against Islamic extremists. The story that defines him happened in 2019 during a particularly brutal jihadist attack in northern Burkina Faso. While politicians in the capital debated policy, Traore and his unit were surrounded by heavily armed militants for 3 days, with minimal supplies and no reinforcement. They survived by sheer determination and tactical brilliance, but the experience crystallized something in Traore's mind. The democratic government they were defending had left them to die while continuing to enrich themselves and their foreign partners. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Burkina Faso, soldiers were being sent to fight with inadequate equipment, irregular pay, and virtually no logistical support. Meanwhile, the democratically elected government of Roch-Marc Christian Kabore was spending millions on luxury vehicles and foreign consultants while claiming they lacked resources for military operations. The disconnect was so stark that it bordered on the absurd. Soldiers were literally collecting money from their own pockets to buy ammunition, while their president attended international democracy summits. Traore's first coup attempt wasn't against the civilian government directly. In January 2022, he participated in overthrowing Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, who had already removed Kabore from power. But Damiba proved to be more of the same, another leader who talked tough while failing to address the fundamental issues destroying the country. When Damiba began negotiating with French officials and showing the same disconnect from reality that had characterized previous leaders, Traore struck again. To understand why Traore's actions resonated so powerfully with ordinary Burkinabe citizens, you have to grasp the spectacular failure of democracy in Burkina Faso. Since the country's transition to multi-party democracy in the early 1990s, every single elected government had promised the same things: security, development, and sovereignty. None delivered on any of these promises. The security situation provides the most damning evidence. When democratic governance was established, Burkina Faso was one of the most peaceful countries in West Africa. 30 years later, nearly half the territory was under jihadist control. Millions of people had been displaced from their homes, and the military was losing ground every month. This wasn't the result of some unavoidable natural disaster. It was the direct consequence of political choices made by democratically elected leaders. The economic picture was equally devastating. Despite billions of dollars in foreign aid and loans, ordinary Burkinabe citizens saw their living standards stagnate or decline. The country remained dependent on exporting raw materials to former colonial powers, while importing finished goods at inflated prices. Democratic governments consistently signed agreements that favored foreign corporations over local development, whether in mining, agriculture, or telecommunications. Perhaps most importantly, the democratic system had become a mechanism for elite enrichment, rather than genuine representation. Elections were expensive spectacles that changed faces but never policies. The same small circle of French-educated elites rotated through positions of power, always promising change while maintaining the exact same relationships with foreign powers and domestic business interests. Citizens weren't blind to these failures. By 2022, polling showed that confidence in democratic institutions had collapsed across not just Burkina Faso, but the entire Sahel region. People had tried voting for change repeatedly and gotten the same results every time. When Traore moved against the government, thousands of people poured into the streets in celebration, not protest. Traore's rise cannot be understood in isolation, because it's part of a broader pattern sweeping across Francophone West Africa. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta overthrew a democratic government in 2020 and has maintained popular support despite international sanctions. In Niger, General Abdourahmane Chiani removed President Mohamed Bazoum in 2023 to massive public celebrations. In Guinea, Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya ended Alpha Condé's increasingly authoritarian rule in 2021. What makes this pattern particularly significant is that these military leaders aren't following the traditional African coup playbook. They're not simply replacing one corrupt elite with another or serving as temporary caretakers before new elections. Instead, they're explicitly rejecting the entire framework of liberal democracy and its associated international relationships. The common thread connecting all these cases is the failure of democratic governments to address two fundamental challenges: security and sovereignty. In each country, elected leaders had proven incapable of protecting their citizens from either jihadist violence or economic exploitation. They had become administrators of decline rather than agents of progress. These military leaders have also broken with another traditional pattern by actively confronting foreign influence. Traore, like his counterparts in Mali and Niger, has ordered French troops to leave, canceled military cooperation agreements, and begun diversifying international partnerships. They've recognized that their country's problems cannot be solved while maintaining the same dependent relationships that created those problems in the first place. Understanding the democracy crisis in Francophone Africa requires examining the role of France, which maintained an elaborate system of political and economic control long after formal decolonization. Through the CFA franc currency, military bases, and political networks, France effectively governed these countries by remote control, while allowing the facade of democratic self-governance. The CFA franc system provides the clearest example of how this worked. 14 African countries were required to deposit 50% of their foreign currency reserves in the French treasury, giving France effective veto power over their economic policies. Any major expenditure or investment required French approval, making genuine sovereignty impossible, regardless of what democratic institutions existed on paper. French military bases served a similar function in the security realm. Rather than helping African countries develop independent defense capabilities, French forces intervened selectively to protect preferred leaders and business interests. They would remove leaders who became too independent, as happened to Laurent Gbagbo in Ivory Coast, while supporting others who maintained the system, even when those leaders were clearly failing their people. Traore and other young military leaders recognized that this system made genuine democracy impossible. How can citizens hold their government accountable when that government's real accountability runs to foreign capitals rather than local constituencies? How can elected leaders implement popular policies when doing so would trigger economic retaliation or military intervention? The current wave of military takeovers represents the first serious challenge to this system since independence. By expelling French forces and breaking economic dependencies, these leaders are creating space for genuine self-governance. even if that self-governance doesn't take the form that Western observers prefer. Critics of Traore and similar leaders often focus on the fact that they came to power through military coups rather than elections. This criticism misses the fundamental point about legitimacy in the current African context. Legitimacy doesn't flow automatically from electoral processes. It requires that those processes produce governments capable of serving their people's basic needs. The democratic governments that these military leaders overthrew had lost legitimacy, not because they lacked electoral mandates, but because they had proven systematically incapable of governing effectively. They couldn't provide security, couldn't deliver economic progress, and couldn't assert national sovereignty. Under these circumstances, the formal procedures of democracy became meaningless exercises that changed nothing substantial. Traore's legitimacy comes from a different source: his ability to address the fundamental challenges that democratic governments had failed to tackle. Since taking power, his government has reorganized military operations, renegotiated international agreements, and begun implementing economic policies focused on local development rather than export dependency. These aren't just different policies, they represent a completely different approach to governance. The enthusiasm that greeted his rise to power wasn't simply anti-democratic sentiment. It was recognition that the existing system had failed so completely that almost any alternative was preferable. When tens of thousands of people voluntarily attended rallies supporting the military government, they weren't celebrating the end of democracy. They were celebrating the end of a system that had consistently betrayed their hopes and interests. What distinguishes Traore from typical military strongmen is his focus on sovereignty as the foundation for everything else. His government's policies flow from a simple recognition: African countries cannot solve their problems while remaining subordinate to external powers that benefit from those problems continuing. This sovereignty agenda goes far beyond symbolic gestures like removing French troops. Traore's government has begun the complex work of building independent institutions capable of defending national interests. They've established new partnerships with countries like Russia and China that offer different terms of engagement. They've initiated currency discussions that could eventually break dependence on the CFA franc. They've prioritized local production and processing of natural resources, rather than simply exporting raw materials. These policies face enormous obstacles, including international sanctions and diplomatic pressure, but they represent the first serious attempt in decades to break the cycle of dependency that has trapped Francophone Africa since independence. Whether they succeed or fail, they're addressing the fundamental problem that democratic governments consistently avoided: the impossibility of genuine self-governance within structures designed to maintain foreign control. Traore's challenge to democracy in Africa forces uncomfortable questions about the relationship between democratic forms and democratic substance. If elections consistently produce governments that cannot govern effectively and serve foreign rather than domestic interests, are those elections really democratic in any meaningful sense? The current crisis suggests that Africa needs to develop its own models of governance, rather than simply adopting institutional forms designed for different historical contexts. Democracy, as practiced in Western countries, emerged from specific cultural, economic, and political conditions that don't exist in contemporary Africa. Trying to reproduce those forms without addressing underlying structural problems has produced the current crisis. This doesn't mean abandoning principles of accountability, representation, and popular participation. It means finding African ways to implement those principles that actually work in African contexts. Traore and similar leaders may be pointing toward alternative models that prioritize effective governance and genuine sovereignty over procedural compliance with Western democratic norms. The ultimate test won't be whether these leaders maintain power through elections, but whether they can build institutions that actually serve their people's needs while maintaining popular legitimacy. If they succeed, they may pioneer new forms of governance that other developing countries could adapt. If they fail, they'll join the long list of African leaders who promised transformation but delivered more of the same. Ibrahim Traore represents something unprecedented in African politics. A young leader who understands that the continent's problems require fundamental systemic change rather than cosmetic reforms. His rise exposes the bankruptcy of a democratic system that delivered neither democracy nor development, serving instead as a mechanism for elite enrichment and foreign control. Whether Traore personally succeeds or fails, the movement he represents cannot be stopped. Across Africa, young people are recognizing that their future requires breaking with institutional arrangements that have consistently failed them. They're willing to support leaders who prioritize effective governance over procedural legitimacy, sovereignty over international approval, and results over rhetoric. The question isn't whether democracy in Africa is at a dead end. It's whether Africa can develop new forms of governance that actually work for African people. Traore and leaders like him are attempting to answer that question through action rather than words. Their success or failure will determine not just the future of their own countries, but the possibility of genuine self-governance across the entire continent. If you want to understand what's really happening in Africa today, you need to look beyond the headlines about military coups and democracy in crisis. You need to understand the deeper story of a generation that refuses to accept failure as permanent and is willing to risk everything to build something better. That story is just beginning, and its outcome will reshape not just Africa, but our understanding of what governance can look like in the 21st century. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because this transformation is happening faster than anyone expected, and you don't want to miss what comes next.